So let's talk about leadership decapitation. We are going to start with the article by Jenna Jordan called When Heads Roll. And then I'm going to supplement that with the second article by Jordan called Attacking the Leader. And I want to start with the 2009 piece, in part because really it does, of the two, it does the best job of sort of laying out the logic of the research and really laying out what she finds. And then the piece from 2014 is a follow-up in which she sort of fleshes out some of the explanatory material from the first argument and adds a really good case study of the experience of leadership decapitation as it was tried to be applied against Al-Qaeda, and sort of highlights the limitations. So let's just sort of cut to the chase immediately. Sort of two things to start with. The first is, what do we mean by leadership decapitation? And that's simply either the killing or the arrest of a terrorist leader. Doesn't need to necessarily be someone at the top of an organization, but people who are in positions of leadership. So that's what we mean by decapitation. What are her findings? And I think it's a pretty straightforward argument. And that is that decapitation does not work as well as policymakers think that it should. What does she find? She finds that as organizations grow in both size and age, it is more likely that they will be able to withstand the removal of leadership. She also finds that religious organizations are highly resistant to leadership decapitation. Further, that decapitation does not increase the likelihood of organizational collapse beyond a group's baseline rate over time. In other words, we know from the research that terrorist groups have particular lifespans. Leadership decapitation does not shorten that lifespan beyond what we could expect had there not been a leadership decapitation. The other thing is that organizations that have not lost leaders are in fact more likely to fall apart than those that have had their leaders removed. And there are some circumstances under which decapitation may in fact strengthen groups. Finally, there are case studies that suggest that decapitation might have an impact on operational capacity, but the findings there are mixed as well. And again, it seems to really be related more to both the size and the age of the organization than to the decapitation strategy in general. In other words, older groups and larger groups that have their leaders removed are also the ones that are the most likely to have that actually not affect their operational capacity, whereas younger groups and smaller groups are the ones that are more likely to see decapitation limit their operational effectiveness. What is it about old and large organizations that makes them appear to be so resilient? This comes from the second piece, Attacking the Leader. Her argument is that these organizations are much more likely to be what she calls bureaucratized. In other words, the terrorist group has essentially become a bureaucratic institution with all of the things that's implied by that. Bureaucracies feature diversified roles and responsibilities, and they maintain clear delineation between duties and power. In other words, the group divides itself up into different tasks and assigns different people to be in charge of and take care of those tasks. Power is divided among the organization in ways that make sense for the tasks that it is performing. Another element of a bureaucratized terrorist group is it establishes rules and routines, and those both enhance the stability of the group over time and its operational efficiency. They're also more likely to experience smooth leadership transitions. In other words, when leadership changes, those changes are much more likely in a bureaucratized group to happen smoothly. And so if you put all those things together, that makes an organization highly resilient to having any of its leaders removed. In other words, they've got systems in place to put new leadership into those roles and to step in and fill those gaps. So that's the first reason that older and larger groups are more likely to be able to resist decapitation strategies. They're more likely to be bureaucratized. The second piece about this, again, larger and older organizations are also much likelier to have large levels, or at least relatively large levels, of popular support. Popular support is the other piece of this puzzle. Groups are resilient because they're bureaucratized and because they have popular support to fall back on. And in that attacking the leader piece, Jordan goes through all of the different things we've already talked about in terms of why popular support matters. And all of that all of those reasons help contribute to the resilience of an organization dealing with a decapitation episode. So those are her findings. Let's go into a little more detail about why the argument was that this should work. And again, the context here is that leadership decapitation has become a prominent strategy, in particular in the American approach toward counterterrorism. This is really what the drone war that the Obama administration launched around 2012 was all about. It was about using high-tech methods to engage in targeted killing of key terrorist leaders and operatives, primarily along the Pakistan-Afghan border. And it was modeled in many ways after the Israeli experience in the occupied territories that Daniel Byman is going to write about and that we'll talk about in another video. Why did anybody think that decapitation would work? Well, a lot of it has to do with these expectations about what we think leadership means. The idea here is that leadership is necessary for a group to both maintain itself as a functioning organization and for it to be efficient. And so the assumption is that if you take away those leaders, then you can basically lead the group to fall apart. The problem with this is that this was an optimistic assumption that was based really on a pretty definitive lack of supporting evidence. So the assumption is that leaders are necessary, leadership is necessary for a group to operate. So if you take that leadership away, you strike a fatal blow. The problem is that when we apply these ideas to terrorist groups, what we recognize is they're not really based on solid evidence. Instead, these policy recommendations were based upon anecdotes, studies of different types of leadership decapitation, particularly the assassination of state leaders, or based upon single case studies that weren't necessarily generalizable. So the policy community essentially said, hey, this stuff should work, and so we're just going to do it, with really not sitting back and asking whether it's an effective strategy. Why target leaders? One of the arguments that Jordan goes into some detail discussing had to do with this idea that charismatic leaders are necessary to hold a group together, and therefore if you remove that charismatic leader, then the group will fall apart. There are, of course, other roles that leaders play. Some leaders can be more operationally oriented as opposed to inspirational leaders. And there's some evidence to suggest that in some cases, if you remove operational leaders, that can, at least for a short period of time, could degrade a group's capacity, but that doesn't last over time. The real problem with the assumption of the reliance of groups on charismatic leadership is that terrorist organizations have adapted to limit the susceptibility to the loss of leadership. And one of the ways they've done this is by becoming more decentralized over time and less hierarchical in order to reduce their vulnerability to the loss of leadership. So that's one of the things. Many of the groups that these strategies are used against have gone to basically a hybrid kind of structure, and Jordan talks about this in the second article, in that they've got essentially a top leadership, and so it looks hierarchical. But operationally, they've moved to decentralized cell structures. And that makes it much more difficult to both identify leadership, but also to have the removal of leadership really make any kind of operational difference. So that's the first thing. As groups became more decentralized, that's reduced their vulnerability. But the other thing is important too, and that is as an organization becomes more institutionalized, in other words, more bureaucratic, it develops the ability to pursue its goals even in the absence of leadership. And so if you lose the leader, the mission of the organization continues. And so that's part of the puzzle as well. Groups adapt, and the adaptations allow them basically to develop a life of their own. So that was one argument, right? That Organizations rely on leaders, and therefore you take those leaders away, the organization falls apart. That doesn't really hold up to scrutiny because of the limited role, frankly, that leaders actually have in holding together larger and older organizations. Another set of ideas about why these vulnerabilities might be there grew out of social network analysis. And again, this is about understanding how the structure of an organization works, and by understanding how the structure of the organization works, you identify points of vulnerability to weaken it. Again, the general assumption here, based on the sort of the lessons of social network theory, is that a hierarchically structured organization is going to be more susceptible to leadership targeting. And I think that the literature sort of holds that out. If any of you were able to watch the Battle of Algiers film, that was essentially the logic of the French strategy to try to break the FLN in Algiers. What they recognized is that it had a hierarchical authority structure, but they didn't know who was on the top of the pyramid, and therefore they had to rebuild that structure from the ground up using extreme methods of intelligence gathering, i.e. torture. The idea being that if you get to the top of the food chain and you remove the top leadership, the entire organization will collapse. And that's ultimately what happens in Algiers. One of the changes that the Irish Republican Army makes in the 1980s is a move away from a hierarchical structure that was easily penetrated by the security forces into a more of a decentralized structure. And so, again, they had a top leadership, but that top leadership was separated and from its what were called active service units that were out across the country engaging in sort of the operational side. And there were very limited contacts between active service units and the leadership, and between active service units and other active service units. And so what that did is that, in fact, enhanced the overall security of the organization by decentralizing it, by making it, again, less vulnerable to having those leaders removed. If we think about how these decentralized networks work, these decentralized organizations work, we stop thinking necessarily about specific leaders, and we start thinking about individuals that we think of as hubs. These are the folks who have the most social ties to other actors, and these represent the way that the organization communicates amongst itself. The problem here is that these communication hubs, these individuals who are acting as sort of the conduits and the points of contact, they're not necessarily in positions of central leadership. And so even if you eliminate those, the central leadership remains and you can rebuild or replace that missing capacity. This is the other thing, right? That groups have that capability to replace leaders. New leaders will emerge, even in decentralized groups. And there is also this reality that they can adapt to having these different sort of nodes in the network broken through decapitation strategy. And so that's really sort of a key piece of it. I mean, the bottom line here is that there's really just a lack of actual evidence that the lessons of social network analysis telling you what nodes or what leaders to take out, there's no real good evidence to suggest that strategy works either. So the idea of charismatic leadership, the idea of targeting decapitation based on understanding the nature of the network, none of those seem to really hold up to solid scrutiny. What does? Well, here's the bottom line, right? When you go through the evidence that Jordan compiles, what she discovers is that taking out the leaders doesn't actually make that much of a difference. Decapitation does not work. Decapitated groups have a lower rate of decline than groups that have not lost their leaders. And in fact, it can be counterproductive, especially if you're using this against larger, older, religious, and separatist groups. Her research and the follow-up research indicates that those kinds of groups tend to emerge from decapitation stronger than if their leaders had not been removed. These policy implications, I think, are really important for us to think about as we think about what can democracies or any country do when facing a terrorist challenge. Taking out the leaders, arresting them, or killing them is counterproductive if that leader is an inspirational or spiritual leader. This is just one of the things the research shows. And in fact, it can be counterproductive because of the tendency for those kinds of operations and those kinds of decapitations to trigger a revenge response on the part of the organization. The very idea that Silk was talking about in that article. At the same time, heavy-handed response by a government can generate support for targeted organizations in the international community. Both the United States and Israel have received considerable international condemnation for the use of targeted killing. And in some cases, this has led to additional support for the organizations whose leadership has been targeted in these ways. At the same time, we see this both in the Palestinian example with Israel and the U.S. Examples with the use of drone strikes. Drone strikes or targeted killings, when they result in civilian casualties, generate public sympathy for the group being targeted. And that's counterproductive from a counterterrorism standpoint. And here's the last piece, which makes this a problematic policy choice. Future leaders may, in fact, be even more radical in their beliefs and more committed to violence in their tactics than the leadership that you have eliminated. So in other words, there's no guarantee that the next set of leaders are going to be any easier to deal with than the ones you got rid of. Where does decapitation seem to work? Small groups, groups that are relatively new on the scene, groups that are more ideological in their motivation. Where does it not work? Larger groups, older groups, groups that are religiously motivated, groups that are motivated by nationalist separatist ideologies. What kinds of groups are both the U.S. and Israel targeting with decapitation strategies? Religious and national separatist groups. And so that might lead you to suggest that that's why we haven't been all that successful with the use of these strategies.